Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Antique Auction Forum podcast. I'm Martin Willis, your host, and we have a great show for you today. I was actually supposed to do this show on location, but a little thing called a virus, very little thing, got in the way. So I'm via Zoom with the curator, Rob Verbsky, and we're going to be talking about the Transportation Museum. I've been there. It's right up the road from me, actually. Beautiful location. I was there at the auction last year. It was fascinating, to say the least. Rob, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's my pleasure to be here.
Rob, like I said, unfortunately, I can't be there to do the show. It would have been really great to have some video right there in the museum and all that, but it is what it is. Can you tell the listening audience that is not familiar, this show does go all over the country, a little bit about the museum and how it got its start?
Oh, sure. We've been around for about 45 years in the mid 1970s. Jim Rockefeller and Tom Watson, who was the chairman of IBM, they both lived around here in Mid-Coast Maine, and they were both passionate about old airplanes and cars and anything mechanical. Uh, and so they thought to themselves, hey, maybe we could open up a museum and have a place where all the old planes and cars could be run for the public. And right about the same time in the 1970s, the airport, which is now Knox County Regional Airport, um, the airport had three runways, and one of the runways was being shut down for flight operations. And it was going to be turned into an industrial park. And that project didn't happen. But what that meant was there was a spot at the airport with runway access that could be done anything that a good plan had. And so it turned into a fortuitous spot and timing to put up a small hangar, bring out an old airplane, and see if the public wanted to see the old planes and cars running. And it was a fantastic success. So the museum started with just a small 3,000 square foot hangar, one airplane and two cars, and started putting on shows every summer. Uh, and now we're 100+ acre campus. We've got about a dozen buildings. We have over 100 vehicles when it comes to cars, airplanes, motorcycles, and then we've got another 10 to 12,000 other artifacts, books, parts, art, all sorts of things. So, I mean, over 45 years, we've gone from literally a dirt road to a sprawling complex of transportation history.
Wow. Yeah, and it's great because all the car museums I've been to in the past, and I did one of these podcasts actually with the I want to say the Black Hawk Museum and in the East Bay of out in California in the San Francisco Bay Area. Beautiful museum, very unusual cars, but they focus on cars. This is pretty rare where you focus on transportation. Are there other museums like this that you're aware of?
Not really. I mean, from that perspective, I came in previous positions. I've worked for multiple aviation museums, um, and and that's the thing. At those museums, we had airplanes. We didn't have cars, and it's the same vice versa. You know, it's a hard thing to do in the first place. Just to even if we weren't operating, that's just a lot more stuff to manage and care for, and diverse skill sets and people to have around. So yeah, there's really very few museums that go across different transportation fields, as it were.
It almost seems to me like that would be kind of a maintenance nightmare because of the variety that you have. How is that all handled?
So that's the part where we can kind of specialize, in the sense that part of the ways that we take care of our collections is we have an aviation workshop and we have an automotive workshop. For each of those shops, we have a full-time conservator who keeps track of everything. But both are our aircraft conservator and our automotive conservator, they both have their teams of volunteers. They each have 50 to 75 volunteers at any given time who do a lot of the work. There's volunteers who all they do is they come in and they polish cars and make sure that brass shines and make sure the tires are filled with air. And then we have guys who are able to fabricate parts out of nothing to make these cars and planes keep on going. So that's where you do kind of have some separate sphere stuff kind of going on, but it still takes a lot of coordination. Very very often, when an airplane needs to get moved, the automotive guys are being sought out to give a hand with that.
Speaking of that, are a number of the airplanes, are they flyable at this point?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. We have, when it comes to aircraft, we have about 16 to 20 aircraft in our collection. And about 12 of them fly right now. We've got 4 more that are being restored and maintained in order to get them flying, hopefully by the end of the year. But, we've just lost a month of work. So We'll see if timelines change.
Yeah, right. Now, what are your thoughts on something that, I've heard some people say, the purist perhaps, that you can over-restore a vehicle. And what just your opinion on that? What do you think about that comment?
We definitely consider that when we're working on stuff, particularly since we are going to run things. It's a very particular question for us where, look, we could do everything exactly right to the way that vehicle came off the assembly line in 1912. But we may now have also made the car so fragile that we can't demonstrate it and we can't show it to the public and we can't let people experience it as it functioned in the world. So that's the part where it's like, one of the things that I tell visitors when they ask how much of your collection actually runs, and it's like, if it leaks, it works. Yeah. That's the thing. If we were to do everything perfectly exactly right, then we'd also be draining everything and pickling everything, and we wouldn't be able to operate. We wouldn't be able to take the risk of even the paint getting chipped then.
Right. And what about what is the most unusual thing that you have in the museum?
The most unusual thing. In a lot of ways, it depends, because we have so many different collections. We've got bicycles, and there are just bicycle museums out there in the world, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
It a lot of it depends on the person and the collection at any given time. What I think is the most unusual is those things in the museum that kind of are at these moments of change and are very just, they're showing exactly when things went from one thing to another. So like from that perspective, one of the things that I think is really unusual in the museum is we have a Colson Fauntleroy wheelchair. And you wouldn't think that a wheelchair would be in a transportation museum when you got, Model Ts and things like that. But the thing is that this was a wheelchair that was designed and built in the 1920s and 30s for survivors of polio. And so what it is that it's a 3-wheeled wheelchair that has levers that then the user is going to pump with their arms, and it even has fully articulated steering. So you twist the handles on this wheelchair in order to steer the front wheel. And so to me, it's just this fantastic example of, before we had a solution to polio, there was this attempt, and a successful one at that, for polio survivors to be mobile and independent and free to move about. It's got bicycle tires on it. That's the thing. Colson made bicycles alongside all of this. They innovated. It's got full spring systems on it, so you can go for, on a bumpy road. This thing's perfectly comfortable.
How about that? That's
Yeah,
awesome.
and that's the thing. And they stopped making these sorts of wheelchairs after polio was solved in the 1950s. But there are now other companies today that are making these sorts of lever wheelchairs again for like paraplegics and things like that. Once again, it's the same thing. They're using bicycle parts and assembling them in a different way to give people independence.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
what's old is new again.
Yeah. Is there ever any like gray line, like the way you just mentioned this? Is there any gray areas between what's transportation and what's not? Like that. To me, I do understand the transportation, but let's say something gets into pleasure. Is that still considered like a boat? A boat is considered or can be considered pleasure, but it's still transportation. I mean, do you ever have any thoughts of where the lines are?
I think in that sense, we're constantly having to draw lines that are in some ways they're always somewhat arbitrary.
Yeah.
Because it all comes down to how somebody uses something, and from that perspective, then for us, it's more about is it a story that we're able to tell appropriately, and is it a thing that we're able to take care of? So like from that perspective, we don't collect boats. We are a landlocked museum, and there are plenty of other boat museums in the area.
Yeah.
So we just let that one go.
Yeah.
But at the same time, plenty of people come to the museum and say, "Hey, you're a transportation museum. Where are the boats?"
Well, I saw them at your auction last year. There were some beauties. So they do at least get to the auction. And we'll talk about the auction a little bit later. It was really quite exciting. What about is it called like the Ornithopter or something like that?
The Ornithopter.
Yeah. Talk about that because that's a wild looking thing.
Right. Yeah. And so yeah, the Ornithopter was this whole class of aircraft that were made, in the 1800s and even after the Wright brothers flew, where you had all sorts of inventors who were looking at flight and saying, well, if we can make a vehicle that flaps like a bird, then we should be able to fly like a bird. And so we have one of these few ornithopters that actually survived. It was made in the early 1900s in Pennsylvania, and it's this wood wagon frame, I guess is the best way to put it. When you're trying to do it without standing next to it, and in the middle of it, there's a seat and an engine, and then up top you've got four wings that when you pull down on the front wings, the back ones go up and they kind of seesaw back and forth. And it's basically got on this big wood frame of these wings is basically chicken wire and then turkey feathers in order to try and create some idea of lift.
Oh my goodness.
The motor would make the wings flap back and forth, and then it would have theoretically taken off.
Have you ever seen video of one of those actually lifting?
Those early ornithopters, those things, if they get off the ground, it's because they're shaking and shimmying so much, they vibrate a few inches off the ground.
Yeah.
So the thing that I find really interesting about ornithopters is they're actually, in recent years, there has been success in making ornithopters. It's an aeronautical engineering department in Canada. I'm drawing a blank on the school right now, but they made an ornithopter a few years ago, and it shows that the idea is sound. It was that in the early 1900s, they didn't have the materials. What they're doing now is they're using carbon fiber and really light foam and saran wrap and things like that
Wow.
to create a strong but flapping structure. So maybe in the future we all will have ornithopters, just when we get the material technology to catch up.
Oh, that is so funny. I know they had, when the pioneers of the helicopter, they had a really difficult time because the blade would go through and make an air pocket for the second blade to come around, and so they had to make it so the blade, kind of like goes back and forth like that in order to actually really work. But they, think of all the trials and errors that they had, and on any type of plane or any type of aviation.
Yeah.
Pretty
Yeah.
pretty scary. So
Oh yeah.
let's talk a little bit about the vehicles in each category. Like for instance, I think the Ornithopter would probably be one of the most interesting things you have in aviation. But what else do you have in aviation that's really interesting?
Well, I mean, in that sense, like when you're talking about helicopters, we have only one helicopter in our collection, and it's actually a prototype helicopter that did not succeed because of the kind of these issues that you were talking about. It's called the Helico Speedster, and it was made by a Austrian arms dealer who poached an engineer from Sikorsky. And so when you look at the Helico Speedster, you see a lot of the same stuff, the same kind of fabric over a tubular frame that you have with the early Sikorskys. And ours is from the middle of World War II, about 1944. And the idea was actually the goal was to put a jet engine on it. But jet technology was not there yet. The jet engine was too big and heavy to lift anything at that point. So they had to transition to a piston engine, and it failed not because there was anything wrong with the design, but basically because of personality conflicts between the two guys. And so it's interesting in that sense that perhaps you would have had some viable competition for Sikorsky in those early days if those two guys had been able to overcome their differences, essentially.
Isn't that funny? I've said a number of times on this show that the story of an object a lot of times makes it really fascinating or interesting, and in some cases valuable. So I'd like to hear some of the stories, or let's start out with the most interesting story related to any of the vehicles there in any category.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. Interesting vehicle stories. I mean, I'd say one of the most popular things that we have in the museum is we have an early 1900s Gypsy Wagon. So the kind of brightly colored horse-drawn wagons that Roma people would have lived in for many years. And so that's right off the bat, the thing that is very interesting about it is traditionally when a Roma person dies, part of the funeral is burning the wagon. So the fact that ours survived shows that even though we don't know who owned it and what happened to them, we already know that something unusual happened because this somehow survived.
Wow.
And same time, it's a really interesting snapshot for people when they come into the museum because ours is bright red. All of our red vehicles are really the most popular ones in the first place. They really stand out. But this is also one where you look at it and you can see, how unusual the life of a Roma person is and was. I mean, they have a very small living space, but it's still ornate. It's personal. They clearly are passionate about the way they live. In when you look at what's inside, it's still, there's lots of fine fabrics and quality materials and things like that.
Wow.
So, it's not like they're living in poor conditions, as it were. So it's this fascinating snapshot of a life. And once again, from today's perspective, is that the tiny house movement is something that people talk about a lot. You look at it and you're like, this is not all that far off from the tiny houses that people are looking at moving into today.
Right. I know there's a movement there. When I was in there last year, I started reading about the first car theft. It was a woman. Yeah.
Yes.
Can you tell that story? That's an awesome story.
Yeah, Bertha Benz. Yeah, we have a replica of the Benz patent wagon, which Carl Benz, who, if people are unfamiliar with cars, that's the Benz of Mercedes-Benz. So Carl Benz is really the first successful automobile from this perspective. He does the perfect matching of the internal combustion engine with a free non-horse-drawn chassis, as it were. And in the first place, it's a fascinating thing when you look at it, because it's very much this fragile vehicle with very tall, spindly wheels. The engine is mounted right behind this very small bench seat. And the flywheel is this big, 4-foot across spinning piece of metal. It's not, it's one of those moments. OSHA would not approve of this if this is the sort of thing that you would happen today, because it's spinning right behind the driver, a couple hundred times a minute. And so the theft story is that his wife, Bertha Benz, she decided that she and the kids were going to go visit her parents about 50 miles away from where they were living. And so she loaded up the kids, and I think it's a single bench seat, and it's a tiller steer, so it's like a boat rudder to steer it. Loaded up the kids, and she's driving in the 1890s, 1887, over dirt roads through towns and villages, places that have never seen an automobile before because it never existed. And part of this journey is also they run out of gas, and of course, there's no such thing as a gas station. There's no need for one. But fortunately, fuel, kerosene, is sold in pharmacies and general stores because it's essentially the same stuff that people are lighting their homes with. So Bert is able to go into a shop and get a quart of fuel to finish the journey. So yeah, basically the inventor of the modern automobile also had it stolen by his wife.
I don't know. I love I don't know if you've ever watched Ken Burns' Horatio's Drive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I love that story. First, actually, transcontinental trip with his car, and what they went through on the way is just totally amazing. And it was all because of a $100 bet or something like that. It's a great show.
Yeah.
I love that.
I love it. They have the car on display at the Smithsonian.
Yeah.
And it's one of my favorite things at the Smithsonian's American History Museum, because they have it posed with mannequins with the Horatio's dog in the front seat of the car, and they're stuck in a ditch, and it's just beautiful. And on top of it, they have the goggles that the dog wore on display in the exhibit.
That's awesome. Now, I know someone would want to ask this question, and I don't know if you know. You probably know. What's the most valuable thing that you have in the museum?
I'm gonna have to give for us, the biggest issue when it comes to value is that, since we don't sell our collections, it's almost impossible to put a value on things, because the thing is, if something were to happen to our museum and we have to go replace our vehicles, we can't.
Right.
It's like we have a 1918 Model T fire truck that was used by the Farmington Fire Department here in Maine. So that's the thing. If something happens to that, sure, we can go out and get another Model T fire truck. That's a relatively easy thing. But it's not the Farmington fire truck.
Yeah.
It doesn't have that history of a Maine community making that transition from a horse-drawn fire pump to an internal combustion one.
Yeah. So. Yeah, I know a lot of things are just, as an appraiser myself, I've run into that. I did an appraisal last year at the School of the Blind with Helen Keller's first letter. How do you put a price on something like that? It's really tough. But is there a Bugatti or something really? Do you have something really unique as far as vehicles go?
We have a lot of unique vehicles in that sense. We have a 1907 Vanderbilt Renault race car.
Wow.
This is one of 5 surviving cars that Willie K. Vanderbilt had ordered from Renault in order to start racing here in the United States.
Wow.
So, and that's the thing, only, I can't remember the exact number, 10 or 12 of them were built in the first place, and he convinced all of his rich buddies to buy them so that they could start doing racing. So from that perspective, the fact that there's only one of, it's only one of 5 left. Ours is one of the few that's also part of a public collection. Most of them are in private hands.
Oh.
So we're one of the few places where you can go any day of the week that after the coronavirus is over. You come in and you can look at one of the cars that got racing started in America.
Wow, get racing started in America. That's a big deal.
Yeah.
And what are, I'll just name off a couple of some of the other rare cars and motorcycles, if you would.
Mm-hmm. When it comes to rare stuff, for us, sometimes it's like, what isn't rare?
Yeah.
But, because it's like when it comes to aircraft, we have one of the Pitcairn mail wings, and a Pitcairn was the predecessor of Eastern Airlines. Pitcairn started making airplanes in the 1920s in order to fly airmail along the East Coast. And so these were the planes where they were starting to build up more capacity. It could carry, in the 1920s and 30s, it could carry, maybe 700 pounds of mail, but it could also be converted to carry 3 passengers. And over time, Pitcairn is able to build bigger and bigger aircraft and also improve service throughout the Southeast. And ours is particularly special because it came from the Pitcairn family. So not only are there very few Pitcairns left in the world, but ours came essentially straight from the source, which is another thing that you really can't, overcome, essentially.
Yeah.
So
and as far as the cars, besides the one, well, I do want to just touch on a couple of cars, and then I know you have motorcycles there too, which I think I saw some real beautiful ones there.
Mm-hmm.
So what are, besides the Renault, the Vanderbilt one, if you wouldn't mind touching on a couple of other rare, I know you said they're all rare, but rare and unusual you may not see at other places.
Right. We have a 1905 Panhard Levasseur. You'll always have to apologize. My French accents are terrible. But it's a 1905. It's a French luxury car. Ours is it is big. It is a big heavy car. But it's a beautiful blue car that was.
I saw that. Yeah.
And it's a car that its design is influenced by the King of Belgium. Well, actually, the King of Belgium's mistress. The design of the seats was based on her suggestions. But it's just this. Also, it's just a it's just one of those cars you look at it and and you see both how rudimentary it is, but also how luxurious it is for the era. So that's something that we have. Um, we have two Rolls Royces. One is a 1914 Rolls Royce that was owned by Alice Longfellow, which is Longfellow's daughter. And this was a car that was over in Europe during World War One. So it basically saw action, as it were. And then when it came back to the United States, it was owned by a fellow named Alan Bemis. And Bemis was not only an old car aficionado, but he was also a scientist. And he did a lot of work with weather monitoring on Mount Washington. And he used his Rolls Royce to get monitoring equipment up to the top of Mount Washington.
Unreal.
So we have that.
Wow.
And we have Clara Bow's Rolls Royce. So this was it's a 1920s Rolls Royce that was given to Clara Bow as a gift. So it's just wonderful to have one of her cars and have that throwback to 1920 flappers scenes. And Clara Bow very famously loved to drive fast and had a lot of fast cars. So this is one of those kinds of cars.
Mm-hmm. And the motorcycles, you have some rare motorcycles. I know I saw displaying now is one that has a steering wheel in the back, which is a red thing. It's it may have been at one of your auctions. I'm not sure. But let's talk about a couple of rare motorcycles. What do you have there?
Mm-hmm. So our motorcycle collection is, when it comes to our vehicles, it's the smallest collection we have. We have about a dozen motorcycles. So one of the rare ones that we have is a 1901 Steffi, which is essentially the beginning of motorcycles. Really, what it is it's a motor mounted on a bicycle. Steffi just made the motor and the stuff, and then it was up to you to get a bicycle and put it all together.
Wow.
It's the handyman special, as it were. But it's a beautiful bike, and when you look at it, you see that in some ways motorcycle design hasn't changed from the beginning. In the sense that you've got the motor mounted along the bottom between the wheels. You've got a fuel tank, positioned between the handlebars and the seat. It's dramatically been improved. It's far more reliable. You can get a lot more power out of it, but it's a much different vehicle, yet being the same.
Wow, that's great. Most people don't like when I ask this question, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Mm-hmm. And that is, what's your favorite thing in the museum?
What's my favorite thing in the museum? Yeah. It's always.
I know they're all your babies, right?
Right.
Let me rephrase that. If you could drive one away, what would you drive away? If you were given the keys to it, say, hey, it's yours for working here.
Mm-hmm. Honestly, the vehicle that I would take, if I could just take a car home every day, is one that's not part of any of our exhibits. Oh. It's actually the truck that our Flightline crew uses during our summer events. It's a 1956 Ford pickup truck.
Is it red, or what color is it?
No, and see, this the truck, you probably walk past it and not notice it because it's just gray. It's got our logo on the side so that people know that it's ours. But when it comes to, that's the thing. What I like about it is that it's still working after all these years. It has a job, and it's functional, but at the same time, it's still beautiful. Like when you look at those 1950s pickup trucks, they've got, there's still a lot of design. and thought that goes into, that hood and front end of the truck. They're still aerodynamic while they're working hard. To me, that's just that's the sort of thing that if I was going to have a car to take home, it'd be something like that.
Yeah, I had a 1941 Dodge pickup truck that I just loved, and it was one of those things I was never going to sell. But things change as you go along in life, and unfortunately, I made the mistake of selling it. I'd still like to have it today. And let's talk about the auction, because one of the things I always wonder when it comes to museum is the funding. Is the auction actually part of your annual funding or fundraiser or any type of?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And that is its purpose. The auction. We've got two full-time staff whose purpose and function is to organize the auction every year. Once the auction is the third Saturday of August every year, and September 1 hits, they're already thinking about the auction for the following year. The auction produces a good 10 to 25% of our revenue, of the museum's revenue for the year. Mm-hmm. So it's both very important, but at the same time, we realize that auctions, the auction market changes, so we're always ready to adjust according to what's happening.
Yeah.
Where we on average get about 200 to 230 cars to put through the auction. In the last few years, we've also had an automobilia auction of gas pumps and signs and things like that. And that's the thing, when someone pays their buyer's premium or their bidder registration, all of that is stuff that then helps support our ability to do exhibits, take care of our cars, put on education programming. All of that the auction helps us fulfill our mission.
What can someone do from afar, like someone that's listening to this podcast? They can simply go to your website and take a poke around and see what you have going on. Which it's just simply owlshead.com, right? Is that what it is?
Owlshead.org.
Owlshead.org for anyone.
Yep.
And I will link that with this podcast as well. And what is the museum looking forward to when we get through this situation? I've been thinking about that. If there are ways that the social distancing could possibly work. Limited visitors, I guess. So what are the thoughts about the reopening possibilities?
Well, in the first place, we're really looking forward to reopening because it's 2020 and it's Maine's bicentennial, and so we have an exhibit opening in honor of Maine's bicentennial.
Yeah.
We were planning to open it in June. We'd like to still be able to do that, but we'll adjust as necessary. We're talking right now about what reopening looks like for the museum. Realizing that just like there's rules for going to the grocery store these days.
Yeah.
We'll have to think these things through.
Yeah.
One of the advantages that we have when it comes to whatever our reopening looks like is that we have a really big building.
Yes, you do. Yeah.
Yeah. So we have opportunities for people to spread out. So
yeah,
it's so it'll be a question of just how do we manage that? So
yeah. And when we were talking earlier about stories, the thought occurred to me that you probably have some visitors that have great stories. Do you hear a lot of them when you're talking to people there?
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's the thing. Very often, all of us give tours and demonstrate vehicles and things like that all the time. And you'll always, people will start telling you stories, and sometimes I'm not the one teaching them; they're teaching me.
Yeah.
And you find out that you're giving someone a ride in a Model T, and they start talking about their grandfather's Model T, or how they learned to drive on their farm, in a Model T. And you get a lot of first car stories that way. People. Last year we had a 1941 Ford Woody wagon donated to the museum for the auction, and the number of people who, while it was on display at the museum, were telling stories about their youth and their times in Ford Woody wagons. You just you want it. You wish you could just always have a recorder going to catch these stories of people's experiences.
That's right. That's right. The most interesting car I ever sold at auction just had a wonderful story. And the first time I saw it, it was basically an auction goer, and he said, "Hey, come to my house sometime. I want to show you my collection." And so I went there, and he said, "Let me show you something downstairs." And it was a 1906 or 1904, I can't remember, Cadillac one lunger. It was, he grew up on a farm where it was used as a saw. They took the back wheel off and put a belt to a saw blade and used it for a saw. And that's how he grew up. And he completely restored it to perfection. It was such a beautiful car. And
Wow.
when he passed away, his wife had me come to the house, and I actually sold the car at auction. And it was just it really was a tremendous car. It was just wonderful. I love to hear those things run. And one last thing, I know you have at least one Stanley steamer, right?
Yes, yeah, we have a Stanley Model K in our collection. We also have a locomobile on loan to us, so we're able to tell quite a bit of the Stanley story in that sense.
Yeah.
Because the same model locomobile that the Stanleys used to drive up Mount Washington. So
Wow.
yeah.
Yeah. That car is really interesting to me because, first of all, you could drive anywhere with that car. If all you have to do is keep the steam going. And I know they've actually talked about in the past to revive some type of steam car. I always thought the early electric cars and the steam cars are really very fascinating.
Yeah, yeah, and and we have a couple of electric cars too. That's the thing. Actually, our 1912 Woods Electric is just a few feet away from our two Stanleys, and so it's this great opportunity to talk to people that that it wasn't obvious that there was going to be gas powered cars.
Yeah,
So,
that's right. And those batteries, you just think of the technology back then. It's a wonder that didn't succeed more. But it was basically battery technology because the motor was easy enough. It's just the battery.
yeah, well, and a lot of it was also the size of the United States. Like that's the real issue is that it's a lot easier to transport gas and refuel when you're trying to drive long distances. I mean, that's the whole issue even these days with Teslas and electric cars is how far can you get on a charge?
That's right.
So that's the thing. Electric cars were really successful in urban areas. The taxi cab companies in New York City preferred the electric cars for many years in the early 1900s. And so in that sense, it's unfortunate when you realize that the transportation world could have been, a different technology depending on what your need was. And maybe cities could have all been electric cars, and then only when you needed to go for a long distance drive did you need a gas car.
Last question. What are other plans that the museum has for the future?
Hmm. Well, the first thing that comes to mind right now is we've been looking at how else we can get more of the museum experience online for people.
Hmm.
It's really unfortunate right now that people can't see things like our Stanley steamers or our electric car. You know, I mean, you can go on our website and you can see a picture of it, and you'll get you know, some information about it, and it's a, you know, it's a nice snippet, but it's not the same as standing in front of it. You know, so we're kind of trying to figure out how can we do more stuff, you know, for people who can't come. You know, and part of that is also because, you know, we are in Mid-Coast Maine. There's not many roads to us.
Yeah.
You have to really decide to come to us.
That's right.
So if we can do more to go to other people, that would be a great success for us.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure. And the website is owlshead.org. Thanks so much, Rob. It's been a real pleasure.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for inviting me on.
All right, everyone. So we'll be back with another episode soon. Thank you for listening.